Very well, we are at the full hour, so I will get us started. Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup group. My name is Morten Elvang, and it's really a pleasure today to have Julia joining from Innsbruck. I got to know you maybe 1.5 years ago when I started dipping my toes in the strategy waters as a strategy baby at the time. And you were one of the persons who were extremely welcoming and patient and taking time to talk. So really appreciate it. And open strategy has really been a big inspiration for me. So super happy that you will join us today. We will follow the same format, which is about 30 minutes for Julia to offer your point of view, and then we will open up for questions and conversation after that. And I suppose that's okay for you, Julia?
Yes, that's perfect.
Very well. So please, the stage is yours.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, sharing my thoughts on strategy, which is not so easy in 30 minutes, I would say. I have a whole class on strategy and then advanced strategy when I'm teaching strategy, which is a year of lectures, which I could fill. But I try to limit myself to those 30 minutes. So as Morten said, I'm a professor of strategic management at the University of Innsbruck, engaging with strategy. And over the last, I would say, now it's 10 years, I have engaged very much in the topic of open strategy, focusing on strategy processes. But before I'll spend a bit of time explaining what I mean with open strategy, I thought I'll focus a little bit on the first question that Morten asked me for this session, which is, what is strategy and what does strategy mean in the future? And therefore, I thought it might make sense to reflect a little bit on the world and environment we are all facing at the moment, not necessarily only organizations, but we as individuals. And I think I don't have to explain in much detail how complex, how uncertain the world has become, not only in terms of all the technological environment that we are facing and the technological developments that we have seen, especially in the last 2 years, but also all the societal challenges that we are facing in terms of climate change, in terms of societal challenges, in terms of geopolitical uncertainty and instability that we are facing at the moment in many domains, I would say. And I would argue that in such a world, such an environment, the role of strategy becomes even more important. Now, the question is really about what is strategy and what would you define as strategy? And that is definitely, I would say, a concept which has many different meanings, many different interpretations. If you talk with others about strategy, it's quite likely that you have a different understanding among the people you are talking to. So when I talk to students, to managers, people in organizations, when we talk about strategy, I ask usually people to think about 3 central questions. And those 3 central questions would be, what is the current situation? Where are we as an organization at the moment? Where do we want to go in the future? So what's the goal? What's the direction we want to take? And then the third question is, how do we get there? What actions do we have to take to achieve that goal? So strategy is mainly about being aware of the current situation, but then having the direction and the goal that you want to pursue. And I would say those questions and being able to answer those questions, that is essential in an environment and a situation that I've just sketched. What would that mean for organizations? For organizations, we have seen, and I would say quite recently, in the last couple of months, we have seen that increasingly strategy is something where people assume that those three questions are answered by somebody at the top of the organization, answered by a strategic leader who knows everything, who has all the important information, and who makes all the decisions with a clear direction, I would say. And we have seen that I'm not getting into politics, but we have seen that in most recent statements. I've just included one of one, let's say, influential CEO here, which goes into this direction of having people at the top who know a lot and who are making the decisions. And this also reflects how traditional strategy processes have been set up for many, many years. So if we go back to the foundations of strategy, it's always this classical foundation where we assume that leaders at the top managers in the top management team meet behind closed doors in the executive boardroom, decide about where should the organization go in the future. They decide on this. Very often in organization, this is even seen as something, let's say, mystical, something secretive. And if it's decided, then it's the task to communicate strategy to middle managers, division heads, and their task is to communicate and somehow even sell strategy within organizations, within teams, within business units. And then those people are responsible for realizing strategy through their actions, through their behavior, through their day-to-day decisions. And this traditional process, at least it seems in the last couple of months, I would say, have even become reinforced, I would say. But the question is, if such an exclusive approach, often even a very secretive approach where just a few are involved, is really still working, is really still a good approach to strategy. If we think about all those complexities, those uncertainties that I've sketched, are really a few people at the top of organizations, I would even argue at the top of government, able to have all this information, to see all those trends, and to make decisions in terms of strategy based on those trends. And I would argue, no, there are more efficient ways to do that, or better ways to do that. And I would argue this based on some numbers that I would bring in. And I love that numbers. I bring them always in because I think they just make a very good example. So I very often ask people and managers to think about what they would guess is the percentage of companies that fail or stumble when there are big disruptions to their industries. And with disruptions, I would mean changes, very fundamental changes, not only in terms of technology, but also in terms of customer preferences, in terms of mechanisms within the market. So maybe all of you can also have some guesses in your minds. What do you think? What might be the percentage of companies in such a situation? And then the next question I would ask, what do you think is the percentage of strategic initiatives, strategies that have been formulated, that have been decided on in executive teams that ultimately fail? And with failing, I would argue, not reach the goals, not reach the intended outcomes, are not even considered or realized at all. So maybe every one of you have some guesses, and then I'll show you the number. With the first question, it's around 2/3 of companies that really are having a hard time in terms of even go bankrupt, being acquired, having a long time of very low performance when they are facing disruption. And even more disturbing is the second number, is that 50 to 90% of strategic initiatives that have been formulated fail. And if you think about the effort that is invested, the time, the resources in formulating those strategies, I would say that can really argue there is a crisis of this traditional strategy approach that I've just sketched. that it's not necessarily working out well. And we have done a lot of research, me together with colleagues over many years, talking to managers, doing surveys, visiting organizations, observing organizations. We came up with a couple of problems of this traditional approach to strategy that I just want to very briefly sketch here. I don't want to go through all of them in detail, but I would argue the biggest problem to this approach is the human brain, because I would say the human brain, it's fascinating, but it has a couple of limitations. The human brain is limited in the amount of information that we can sense, that we can process, and that we can store over time. But we know in our reality, we are confronted with just tons of information. So over time, to be able to survive in such complex environments, the human brain came up with, I would say, a survival mechanism. And this is building up so-called cognitive maps. And those cognitive maps are somehow shortcuts about assumptions about how the world works. They are built up over time. They are built up through our education, through our interactions with others, through our experience over time. And they just help us to decide what information is relevant, what information do I see, what information do I consider as relevant when making my decisions. Now, they are great, they help us to survive, but the big problem is people who have the same education, the same background, the same experience, work in the same industry, in the same organization, are very likely to have the same cognitive map and see the same information as relevant. And the problem here is, so if you have a group of executives within an organization, they might all have very similar cognitive maps and see the same information as relevant, build their decisions on the same information. And the problem is if we have a big change in the environment, because these cognitive maps can't change so quickly. They are very stable. They are very rigid because they are built up over time. Now we see that those old locked in cognitive maps, of course, lead to big failures in organizations. There are many examples where organizations were just not able to respond to big changes. And I think we have all heard about Kodak, about Nokia, about other big organizations where this was a big problem. So we have situations of those executives at the top that might have a lot of experience and do everything right, but based on the cognitive maps, they are just not able to see the diverse picture that would be relevant in their situations. And there is a very interesting book, maybe you have heard about that, Seeing What Others Don't See, where Gary Klein was investigating and exploring the 120 most important discoveries and inventions in the history, and he was looking at the patterns, if it was coincidence and how they were developed, and 82% were just developed because insights from different fields, from very different perspectives were combined. So it shows that it's so important that we go beyond this established cognitive maps within small teams, go beyond silos, and overcome these troubles that might be present within small groups, or let's say those lonely strategic leaders at the top that are typically involved in strategy work. And there is a last problem that we have identified quite often, and this is a lack of psychological ownership. If you remember the process that I've sketched at the very beginning, where strategy is formulated in a boardroom and how long it takes until it reaches people who realize strategy in their day-to-day actions, that is quite, let's say, passive. So if you're just a passive recipient of strategy, it's very difficult to get emotional about such a strategy and feel part of it. And we see that in, I think the most recent Gallup data has been out most recently, and you see that more than 50% of employees feel quietly detached and disengaged from work. So are no longer emotionally attached and are no longer willing to do more than is required. So they are not going this extra step. I'm not talking about those who are actively disengaged. And I think that's a big problem and also contributes a lot to this 50 to 90% of strategic initiatives that fail, that we have heard. So the people who would be responsible in transferring strategy, because I think that is something that is really important to have in mind. Strategy is much more than just having a strategy formulated on paper, on your homepage, or even in a nice PowerPoint deck. It needs to be enacted. It needs to be realized. And that just happens based on the people within organizations. And if they are not, let's say, part of that and do not understand the strategy or are not committed to it, it's just very difficult. So what is the solution? What can you do? What would we suggest based on the research that we have been doing over a couple of years now? And it might not be a surprise based on the title of my presentation that we would suggest to open up. As a university professor, I have to give a definition on one point of time in my presentation. So that's the definition of open strategy. Don't worry, it's quite easy. Open strategy is increasing transparency and inclusion of actors that are usually not included in strategy processes per se. So when we look at the transparency dimension, it's really about giving much more information, strategic information to people within organizations or outside. There is one example, I've shown that to you, to a company that we are working together with in Austria. It's a company in producing high-tech connector systems. It grew very rapidly in the last decade from just around 20 employees to more than 600. It has now more than 160 millions of euros of revenue. And they really practice radical transparency based on a digital app that they are using within their organization. That is now the main channel of communication for every information. It's not email, it's not homepage, it's not website. It is just this app. Everybody has it on the mobile phone. It's displayed on screens, in the production sites, in their offices. All the information, communication is done there. It's strategic information, operational information, but also social information that is shared there. Every strategic decision taken by top management is displayed there. Everybody sees all the numbers, sees justifications for decisions. So it's a very transparent communication, and we are doing research there. I think we have now conducted more than 100 interviews with people there, and you can really feel that it contributes a lot to the understanding and the commitment of people when they realize, when they have the information about what's going on. Of course, there are some challenges in terms of ensure understanding, but people are much more feeling part if they have the information. It's no longer a secretive process that is taking place behind closed doors, but people have the information. That's the first dimension. And then the second one is going even beyond just sharing information, and that is inclusion. Really include people in the process of strategy by asking for their ideas, asking for their proposals, asking for their views and perspectives. And with people, I mean employees throughout the entire organization, no matter, regardless of their rank, of their function, of their background. You could even involve people from outside the organization. I have here an example of Barclays, the British bank. They have done this within their organization without going into too much detail. They have done this with very different initiatives, having here very different working groups where they started out to formulate their new strategy, different working groups, different workshop styles, where they formulated a first plan. They did not stop here. They went even further because they realized how important it is to have a very simple strategy that everybody could understand. as was voiced here by their CEO. They had many town hall meetings where they discussed their provisional strategy even further with the employees. And in the end, they even held an online strategy jam over 1 week involving all the 30,000 employees on an online platform. And what they realized is that they were not only getting a lot of input and ideas and saw what is relevant, but more importantly, they got everybody involved. So it was really, they said everybody passively, by just reading through the platform, by talking with others about this, were just involved. Everybody knew what was going on, knew what was the reason, why are we discussing those ideas, why is that relevant? And when they realized, based on the outcomes of this whole exercise, they were able to act very, very quickly afterwards. So the whole process here might seem very time consuming to involve everybody. And we all know that the more people you involve, the slower a process might get. But at one point in time, they realized when they had made a decision, they were quite quickly, because they didn't need to sell the strategy. They didn't need to make this roadshow to convince people to communicate. Everybody was already on board. We did a lot of surveys to see how this openness in terms of transparency and inclusion, what would be benefits, what would be consequences. And here you see some of the benefits ranked based on their importance, based on the surveys that we did. And here we found all benefits that say, okay, by involving many people, having many diverse perspectives, you got better ideas. You get ideas that you wouldn't have within your small team because you were not able to go beyond your cognitive models and cognitive frames and think differently. You couldn't see the relevance of information that others who are coming from different fields would have. So increasing the diversity of people, cognitive diversity of people in the process raises the quality of ideas. But more importantly, even, and that was interesting for us to see, is by involving the people, you improve understanding, you improve acceptance, you improve commitment. And commitment in psychology comes before action. You need commitment before people get active. And that's quite interesting. So you can see by involving people, you can improve understanding and commitment, and therefore you can improve actual implementation of strategy. And therefore, by opening up, you can address all those shortcomings that I've just listed before of this traditional exclusive strategy process. Now, just shortly to give you in the remaining time some idea about how can those open processes even look like. We have seen the example of transparent communication, but also of involving people through workshops, online jams. We have tried to cluster openness along the strategy process based on the different phases in the strategy process that we see in strategy literature. The first phase would be that you try to identify a lot of ideas about potential directions in the future. So about potential trends in the environment, about trends in the industry, about, okay, where should we go in the future? Broad ideas, broad trends. I'm not talking about specifically formulated strategies, but broad trends. Where should we go in the future? And we saw many examples where organizations have done that. One great example was when we talked to people at Ericsson. At Ericsson, based on employee initiative, very organically, an online platform was developed called Strategy Perspective Online Community, where over time people from Ericsson, from all backgrounds, functions, engaged in a discussion about future trends of the industry, about technological developments in the relevant industries, but also beyond, about management practices at Ericsson. And at one point in time, they had even more than 2,000 participants who were engaging really in in-depth discussion. And really, it was not just a post or a comment People were uploading extensive reports, extensive discussions. They found that people within the organization had knowledge and background which went way beyond their official, let's say, job description. So it was a very, very fruitful, deep discussion about potential, let's say, future directions of the industry and the organization. Of course, you can become even more specific and go deeper, and even go into formulation of strategies. And we had a very interesting example of BPW. I call it BPW. It's a German family-owned axle systems and brake technology provider. The interesting thing is that this company was very successful in developing new innovative products, also based on digital technologies, but they always had a hard time in commercializing them because they were always having a hard time to think beyond their established business model. So they developed, in one case, a very innovative technology called iGood, which would allow truck drivers to monitor in real time the forces on the freight securing belts in their truck to avoid freight damage, which is a big issue in this industry, and have an app on their smartphone which would give warnings in real time if there is something changing. So the technology was there, but then they invited people from all over the organization, but also external people, like from startups, from different industries, to engage in a multi-day workshop. And they even had a workshop series to develop a business model around this technology. And that helped them to go beyond their assumptions about how sales is organized. Because, of course, this technology requires a very different sales channel than their typical sales channel based on sales representatives, for example. So they were able to develop this business model within these very, let's say, diverse teams where internals and externals were working together. And they really said that helped them in the formulation to go beyond those barriers that they would have in their mind. One example where openness helped. And then finally, you can even move further and focus a lot on execution, although I would mention that those phases cannot be separated. So they are, of course, interlinked, and you might have spillover effect from one to the other. But a very good example is Telefonica, this big telecommunication firm. And what's amazing there is they were using an employee social network, again, that was employee initiative, not introduced based on management initiative, but came, let's say, from the ground of the organization organically. They used this employee social network to exchange ideas, to exchange perspectives. And it grew over time so much that they had more than 95,000 people engaging in this network. And they used it in different ways. They used it before the executive strategy summit to collect ideas. They broadcasted the executive summits in real time. People could comment, people could bring in their ideas. And finally, the CEO used this network also to ask all the employees about ideas about how they would reposition Telefonica if they would be the CEO, and what they would change and do. And that really then led to a big repositioning, strategic repositioning of the organization. And we talked to the people there, and they really said, okay, being involved in this employee social network and being able to engage in the discussion really transformed employees there from being just passive listeners or recipients of their strategy to really become active participants. And they said, okay, people internalized the strategy, they increased the knowledge about the strategy, and they worked really on the strategy with real commitment because, and I like this quote here, because people feel part of it. They were no longer just recipients of the information, they felt ownership. And feeling ownership is, again, the prerequisite for commitment, which is the prerequisite for action. Now, to sum up, I've brought a lot of examples about what openness can mean, and you heard different examples, different approaches. Just to sum that up in the end, what we have found is digital initiatives like social networks, online communities, online jams, but also analog workshop settings and working groups. Now, we found within our research that those digital crowds allow you to have a broad reach. You can reach out easily across geographic boundaries, involve thousands of people. But of course, you have then the problem that you get a lot of input that you have to filter, that you have to evaluate, that you have to engage with. Of course, you have less control. Although everybody we talked to said it was never a problem to moderate contributions and getting relevant contributions, but of course you get a lot. With analog workshops, of course, you can work on more specific questions, as we saw with the workshops of BPW. You can go into formulation. You can go into more detail. You can specifically select people to be invited. But then, of course, it's your burden to find the right people. With digital crowds, you can just send an invitation and people self-select. You get fewer ideas, and that might mean fewer diversity. But of course, fewer diversity means it's easier to manage them. So to close the circle in the end and come back to the crisis setting and the difficult setting that I sketched out at the very beginning, I thought I'll bring in some insights also from a most recent research project that I'm doing based on funding from the Austrian National Bank. And this is bringing together open strategy and openness with the crisis context, and especially with the situation where organizations are close to insolvency, are under financial distress. And this situation typically brings very specific challenges and requirements that I've listed here. But we have found in our research that openness helps to address those challenges, even though at the first view, you might assume openness in crisis situation, there's just not the time. We need somebody who makes quick decisions from the top to address this crisis. No, also in the cases of crisis, it becomes very important to get everybody involved, to get new ideas, to go beyond the current situation, and to have the commitment and the trust of everybody who is involved in such a crisis situation, and to act fast, because if everybody is involved, you can do that quicker than you can, rather than engage in a lot of convincing and selling processes. I won't go into the specific example that we are currently investigating, and I'm ending here so that we have enough time for questions, comments, suggestions, ideas. I'm really looking forward to hearing thoughts and input from the crowd.
Thank you very much, Julia. I forgot to ask, is it okay to have your presentation material?
Yeah, sure. I can share that. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I have one question for you before we just let it open.
Yeah.
And you already very well explained how open strategy is opposing the more traditional top-down closed approach. I was still wondering, sort of in the recent years, have you seen anything change to the field of strategy? So it's a little bit like, is there like a new appetite developing, or some trends which have been surprising you, or where, I mean, other than this almost like chronic tension between openness and closeness, have you seen something developing in the area?
Mm-hmm. Good question. I mean, I would say there have been different related movements, which might be not exactly the same as openness in the strategy process, but which might go into the same direction, and of course also affect strategy. If we think about all the approaches that we have in terms of new organizational structures and ways to set up and organize, let's say, corporations per se. We have seen a lot in terms of let's say, flatter organizations, holacracy, team-based organizations. So not necessarily coming from the strategy direction, but from the organizational structure direction, which of course has then a lot of influence on how information and knowledge is collected and channeled, how decisions are taken, how the autonomy of actions. So I think there have been different movements over the last decade that are very closely related. Also, when we think about agile and all those movements that go into that direction, I think they have all, let's say, maybe they share some philosophy in the background, but have come from different directions. I would say there is still, and maybe even most recently, even more skepticism in terms of at the very top of organizations in leadership levels about how this could work, what that would mean, what that would mean for traditional role assumptions that we have in organizations. So I have seen that back and forth. I would even go down beyond just strategy, which is already broad, and say it has to do with how we define management and innovation of management practices, and also everything that is related to that. Even though that's a very broad answer, I know.
Thank you. Let's open it up. Any questions or comments? I know there were some questions in the chat, so I appreciate if you would ask those yourself.
I have a question, Morten.
Please.
It's Ken here. Julia, thanks very much for the excellent presentation. I have a question on these open strategies. You mentioned an application. Is that a custom in-house application, or was it something you said was developed? Is it an external application or something you can?
Which example did you mean? I just didn't get it.
There was some company you mentioned where there was an application that they're using, which is all the communications is done.
Yeah. It differs. I mean, we have worked with organizations that are just using, let's say, customized solutions that are there. There are many customized solutions that allow communication within organizations, employee social network solutions. So in two cases that we were working and that I presented here, it was something that they just bought from a provider. We had one case where an organization, they built their own application for their gem. What they had done, that when they opened it up for their Open Strategy Gem, is that they were so overwhelmed by the number of people who were contributing and discussing that the first few days, or the first day, the entire platform just broke down. So they were just overwhelmed. They had to fix it. But of course, there are different opportunities. I would say the majority are using existing solutions and are adapting them if it's a digital-based application. There are many different providers. I think in terms of Ericsson, they are using an in-house application. Telefonica, they bought it. It was an existing provider.
And the other question was, so what happens if the strategy results in significant job losses or a change where the staff or the teams aren't able to adjust to this new strategy? It's like the turkey's voting for Christmas, right? How's that work?
Yeah, I know. Of course, there are situations where it can be quite, let's say, transparency needs to be handled carefully. I mean, the last example that I just skipped, the Visa example, in the crisis situation. That's exactly a good example for that, because that's a little startup. It's a mortgage service provider in the Netherlands, and they are based on holacracy, but they also give people a lot of autonomy and how they're making decisions, but they are also having radical transparency within the organization. So everything is transparent unless it would harm a customer. But so everything is transparent. And they, a few years ago, when we had those high inflation rates and high interest rates, they had, of course, a hard time, and were really getting into troubles. And the interesting thing is, here we were talking with the founders, and they said in this situation, it was not the founders that said, okay, we need to do something, but people, because they had the transparency on all the information, approached leadership and said, guys, we see the numbers, we see what's going on, we see our situation, you need to do something, and we know you have to cut costs, and we know that the consequence might be only that we need to you need to let people go. And they had to cut down the entire workforce by half. So they reduced from I think more than around 50 to nearly 20. And people even volunteered, and that was quite surprising, to go, because they said, okay, I was thinking about changes. I know you need to do something in order to have the organization to survive, or that the firm can survive. I will go. And that was quite amazing for us to see. I mean, people really, it was hard for them, but they, because they had the information, because they knew what was going on, because they felt informed, they saw what were the consequences. And it was not like for them a big shock coming out of nowhere. What we see now also in Austria with big, let's say, organizations that go into insolvency, where employees are surprised, where they come in shock, and then you have to explain, you have to justify. That was not the case in this situation. And even people now, they were really able to recover very, very quickly. And now they are already back to more than 30 employees, and even people came back. So you saw that it wasn't, they had a very good atmosphere. I mean, I have to mention that they had, because of their unique setup, because of the transparency, they were employer of the year and best employer for many years in Europe. But you see, openness in crisis situation can work and even increase acceptance here, where you would think it's better to keep that secret, or that's delicate, or that's sensitive. Even here, openness might help.
Maro?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Thanks, Julia. I have a few questions in the chat, but I have an additional one that I thought I'd ask personally. First time I heard about open strategy was in 2020. It was two professors from Berlin, and it was already published and apparently quite widespread already. But I wonder, in those years where you've had many case studies, etc., do you see any environmental or contextual factors that
Maro, I'm really sorry. I muted you when I tried to lower your hand, so please unmute yourself. My bad.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I have
no
to
worries.
practice.
The entire question, Julia, or how much did you get? Until when?
So if there are any environmental or contextual factors that influence the openness of organizations?
No, that influence the success of using open strategy. So because we've been using it for many years already.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would be very curious to see.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, open strategy is something, I think it has been around already for a very long time, because if we see at examples, I mean, I've been talking with Gary Hamel on that, who wrote the foreword to our book, and he already brought examples of Nokia in the 90s about openness and strategy processes. It might be around for some time. Of course, there was not this joint, let's say, umbrella term of open strategy that was first introduced in 2011 by Richard Whittington from Oxford. And then I would say we had an agreement on the term at least in academia. So at least was the starting point in terms of open strategy research. And we saw research, I would say, starting from, there were single around 2014, and since 2017, I think that the open strategy research community in academia at least developed. And we are finding more and more organizations that are approaching us and saying, okay, we are doing something like you are describing. Of course, we are not calling it open strategy, but it fits your description of the practices and the methods that you are describing. So just to address that, in terms of contextual factors or environmental factors that are influencing the success of open strategy, I would go even lower and would say organizational factors that influence the success of open strategy. And here I would definitely just start with the support of leadership within an organization. I think that's the main factor that we have seen over years. If those initiatives start off, and we have seen that quite often, I've mentioned that in the presentation, without formal, let's say, it's not a formal initiative where the CEO says, we want to open up the strategy process, but it starts organically, or it starts because a middle manager, somebody in the management team, in the executive team says, okay, that is something that we think we should do. And if you don't have the full support of leadership throughout the process, it's just very difficult to make it happen. So if you have some approaches, but if you realize, okay, the leadership is not taking this seriously, is not giving the full support in terms of the resources that are necessary, in terms of the resources, in terms of time, human resources, that people do not see that their contributions are taken seriously, are really taken into consideration when strategy is developed. If it's more of, we even call it open washing, where you give people the feeling that they can give some input, but you're not taking it seriously. If all of this is taking the place, of course, openness is not leveraged to its potential. So I would even start with the organizational culture and leadership support within organizations. Then I would say it's not necessarily, we have seen small startups, we have seen medium-sized family-owned companies, we have seen companies in very traditional manufacturing industries, we have seen big corporations in the tech sector with digital business models. So all around, we have even seen companies, public institutions, and with military background and a governmental background. So then I would say it's not necessarily about these factors, but having the support, having somebody in an organization very high, the higher the better, that really believes that openness is something that is valuable.
If I can have one follow-up, Julia.
Yeah.
I was also thinking primarily organizational factors when I asked my question, but I was wondering, maybe, did you find any correlations over the past years, anything statistical? For example, you mentioned something earlier about people using holacracy. Some organizations, smaller organizations, 30 people scale, orders of magnitude, using holacracy. Any kind of such correlations did you observe, you or your colleagues?
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think that is something that we are currently working on in order to find those correlations or see bigger trends. We are currently working on being able to capture open strategy quantitatively in terms of getting an idea about how many organizations are doing that and being able to see such correlations. At the moment, we are really working with a lot of case studies and can just draw evidence from what we observe based on those case studies. And here we really see the whole picture here. I mean, what you can say, if you start off small in startups per se and based on their small size, those processes are open because you do not have you only have a few employees and everybody is somehow involved in everything and everybody has all the information. And then as organizations grow, of course, per se, processes become less open. So you could say, okay, with increasing size, organizations might lose this natural openness. There is just a very interesting academic study coming out in long-range planning that is exactly looking at how openness changes when those startups are scaling up and growing. So that might be a factor, but we have seen those large corporations like Telefonica, which are very open, but have more than 130,000 employees. So there are ways to do that, but, and I've shown that, the thing is, openness it's a very broad spectrum of practices. There are many different ways to be open, and there are many different degrees on how open you can be. But the beauty is that every kind of organization can find its good approach to do that. But long answer, short summary, we would love to find a way to capture openness quantitatively, to have some kind of idea about what are specific factors influencing this. Also not only based on the feeling that we have from our cases, but hard fact data here.
Any more questions? Tom has a question.
Yeah, I put my question in the chat. Julia, you started out with the well-known failure rate for strategy planning. Do you have any evidence that open strategy changes the failure rate in a positive direction?
I mean, as I've said, not necessarily across many organizations. What we do have is we did most recently some studies, and the first one is within an organization that opened up its strategy process. And what we did there is then, rightly after their open strategy initiative, we did a large-scale survey among all employees within the organization. The organization has, I think, around 3,000 employees, and we got responses from more than 1,000 employees, and we got responses from employees that were involved in those. They had a series of workshops and sprints and very intense ways to involve those people. And then we had the responses of people who were not involved at all. And we asked them, based on scientific scales, about their understanding of the strategy, their acceptance of the strategy, their psychological ownership they feel for the strategy, the commitment they have for the strategy. And we do, I mean, we are not surprised, but we are happy to see that we have statistically significant differences in terms of all of those factors for those who participated. So within this organization, we can say, yes, being part of this open strategy initiative led to this involvement. And we have the good situation that they developed a new strategy here, and we specifically asked for the understanding of this newly development strategy and the commitment to this newly developed strategy in order to avoid some kind of endogeneity. You never have that at all, but it was somehow set up like a field experiment to be more sure about the causality. So in this case, we can really say, yes, openness led to all of those factors that, based on what we know from literature, are all prerequisites for action in implementation. And implementation is really about becoming active.
Yeah, that's good. I hope you can share URLs or titles for any research like that. Number one.
Sure.
Okay, and maybe in the chat now, but maybe I'm not sure how, but via Morten. But now that
I'm happy to be your middleman.
Good. My real question was not, did people, if you like, feel better about this? They probably do. But I was actually about business results.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's
strategy succeeds when the business results come, not when people feel good but don't deliver results. You know that, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's a good thing. Again, we all we have are those anecdotal evidence based on the case studies where we see those results. For example, I think in the case of Barclays, they could show how quickly they developed specific digital apps that became very successful, where they increased their market share, where they increased their return on investments based on what has been developed in those initiatives. So but we do not have it on a large scale, because at the moment we do not have a measure where we can measure openness of organizations on a large scale, which we could then relate on a larger scale to outcomes like profitability, performance. And there we always would have, of course, the question about what's in between, because strategy is something, of course, that is long term. Do we have those direct effects? What do we have between the open strategy initiative that might start out with identifying trends at the beginning until something is built up, a new business model is set up, we go into a new field, we go into new industry. That might take many years and many things can happen in between. So there's always a question about direct causality, but that would be the aim. I would definitely say that would be the aim currently of the research field, to be able to provide not only anecdotal evidence based on individual cases, which is there, what we see, but go beyond on a larger scale.
Okay, good luck. Hope it does change the percentage success.
We hope so. We hope so.
Thank you.
If there's space for one, if nobody wants to ask, I have a question about the previous slide, the one before last, that Professor Hautz, just sorry for calling you Julia the entire time, I forgot. Just skipped the slide just before the last one. You said there was a case study and you wouldn't have time. If you judge that a couple of minutes are enough to tell us something about it, I would love to.
Okay. Yeah, let me go back. I mean, that was just, I explained that before. That was this mortgage service provider in the Netherlands. They were set up. Here are just some key facts about the organization, but I think the most important thing is about the principles they are built on. And we are currently also doing a big research project on this one, because it's just an amazing case, interviewing all the employees, but also the employees that were laid off during the crisis that they were facing. So as you can see, they have those 10 rules, they have this holacracy, their holocratic model is even accessible via, I think it's Glassrock, where you can look at the circles and individual circles, how they are organized. They have a rotation principle in terms of leadership. They follow primus inter pares, so leading of equals, very horizontal, a lot of autonomy. And then I think the last rule is the very interesting one also in our case, no secrecy, but radical transparency, really about every information that can be shared without harming privacy of customers. So everybody within the organization is informed. And for us, it was really interesting. I mean, I talked to Tom van Luppe, who is the founder, one of the founders, and we talked about the holocratic model per se, and I found it very interesting to hear about their principles of openness. And then he said, yeah, but it was very helpful 2 years ago when we had this crisis, and he talked about the crisis and where they were really facing the threat of insolvency and had to let people go and cut the costs by half in terms of letting half of the people go. And I said, how could you do that so fast? And how could you recover so fast? And then we got into this talk that he said, okay, the employees approached us. They told us and said, okay, guys, you need to do something in the leadership team. You can't hope that something gets better. Get active now. And that's so different from situations in big organizations and cases of insolvency that we have currently seen, for example, also in Austria, where we have, I don't know if you have heard about KTM or Signa, very, very big insolvency companies where everybody was surprised about the insolvency and people were just in shock. And here it was very differently. And here they could become quite active, quite quickly active. And in such a situation, time is so precious because people, they didn't have to fight for acceptance. People understood that something is necessary and people were willing to go into that. And therefore, I think we said, okay, it's not necessarily about the feeling of people, but we need to have hard outcome. But, and I think there we come to a circle or close to circle again, you can only be successful and realize your strategy is successful if you have your people on board and if people feel engaged. And if people feel part of it and are willing to go this one step further and are not just willing to do the job on their job description. And if you have people that they are willing to commit themselves to getting active, it's much more likely to have then the business numbers also in line. It's not necessarily always the case, but I think it's a prerequisite. So I think having something that gets the acceptance of the people and their commitment is already, let's say, a big part of the story. And I think that example is a quite good one to show that. And we are currently working on several papers and research studies based on this case, which are hopefully out in the coming years.
Julia, thank you so much. You warned us that time would be short, and indeed it was. So people will start leaving us. But I guess I still have a few minutes if somebody wants to hang on. Was there some last question we didn't get answered? Otherwise, I had one last one for you, Julia. Is there anything you want to ask us or anything we can do for you?
Oh, yeah, reach out to me if you have any ideas, any further questions, any interest, anything that you would like to share, any cases, organizations, questions, concerns and skepticism. I'm very happy to continue the conversation in any way, via LinkedIn, via Morton, via email. So just reach out and get in touch. Always happy to exchange. Thank you. And I see you have Beyond Budgeting here, which is a good bridge for tomorrow morning, where we will actually have Bjarne Buksnes visiting on that topic. So connected. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate. And thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to share my work and my insights here.